Again, giving you a little overview for this week's lesson, this week's class, for our online classes, which is going to follow Chapter 3 in the textbook, America, which is entitled The British Atlantic World. So I'm going to give you an overview of this and talk about what that is, go over that in the readings for this week. So last time, you had an introduction to the various types of colonies that were founded in North America in the 16th and 17th centuries. You get a sense of what the British did, the English did essentially in the 16th and 17th centuries to establish themselves in North America. You saw some of the major Indian wars they fought toward the end of the 17th century in the 1670s. And so you get a little background for where our focus shifts to Britain. Because, as you're going to kind of see from the end of this, it becomes the British who ultimately give shape and form, and basically to most of North American society. The French, as we're going to see, have settled Canada, will become Canada. That too will be come under the auspices of the British Empire. And when your textbook mentions Atlantic world, that's a term historians use. It just means to refer to the way the colonies are part of an Atlantic system of trade, for example, going back and forth from Europe to South America, to Africa, crisscrossing the ocean to the colonies, and then back to Great Britain. A movement for people, and of course people, slaves from Africa to the New World, then shipping goods, of course, grown in the colonies back to Britain and Europe, things like sugar, tobacco, stuff like that. And what's going to happen politically over this period discussed in your textbook, which is about 1660 to 1750, about a 100-year period, is that the North American colonies founded by England are going to become more integrated, firmly integrated into an imperial system. And what I mean by that is they're going to become much more substantially English colonies. They are anyway, but a lot of these colonies are founded by private companies. They're kind of doing their own thing. These colonies will, by the way, have their own political and very, local traditions. But as you get toward the end of the period, they become much more tied to the British Empire politically, but also culturally and socially speaking as well. And so you're going to have them that'll cause problems at the end of this period. We'll see potential problems at the end of this period, but also make them grow, make them very wealthy. They benefit from their position within the British Empire. And so this will create a series of, and we'll get to this in the readings in a second, the source readings. It'll create a series of maritime cities in the north. This will be at the end of the period, New York and Boston emerging as important port cities. They're not nearly as big as London or Paris or the big cities in Europe. They become centers of trade. And because that is what births the British Empire, is trade. That's what America flourishes out of. And it's, of course, the northern ports are the hub for the most part. The Caribbean's also very important, although it's a hub mostly for slaves and for different things because of its position within that empire. So that's what I mean by Atlantic world and why it comes to the fore in this period. And so the other thing I want to go over and just talk about is the creation of the British Empire. Remember, we have this difference between English and British, and where does that come from? It comes from this period. A little bit of background, you may have gotten this from the text, but just to go through it, during the 1640s, the English had a civil war. And in fact, their civil wars involved the rest of the British Isles, Ireland, Scotland. They all had a big problem, all led to the destruction of the English monarchy. And then it was brought back in 1660. The monarchy was restored. And so you have this sort of tug of war for about 20 or so years between the monarchy, which wants to kind of go in a more continental French absolutist direction, governmentally speaking, and those who don't want to do that, basically. It's sometimes called the country party. And so the king at the time, Charles II, manages to pass on his crown to his brother, who, long story short, James II, does some things to make the British people uneasy, abrogates English law in ways they don't think are just. He also happens to be Roman Catholic. England is a Protestant country. They don't trust him for that reason. Most English Protestants are kind of prejudiced against Catholics. And so they have a revolution, sometimes called the Glorious Revolution, in which they get rid of him and they replace him with a Dutch leader named, we'll come to know, William III. And long and short of this is that this is what's going to lead to England becoming Britain and becoming an empire. Because what's going to happen, the revolution happens in 1688. About 20 years later, England is going to unite its crown, its dynastic, monarchy, with the monarchy of Scotland and that of Ireland. And so it'll become the United Kingdom of Great Britain, the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, and Ireland. For short, we call Great Britain, basically, the UK, as it is today, without the Republic of Ireland. But long story short, it'll become, and they'll do this, by the way, by parliamentary statute in 1707, the Act of Union creates Britain as the entity when we know it. And just for our purposes, as colonial history here of America, has one big implication. Before they got rid of James II, the English government seemed to want to exert much more direct control over its North American colonies than it had before. And the Glorious Revolution in 1688 basically does away with that, because the revolution begins to involve England and then Britain in a series of wars on the continent, which lead to it becoming a great imperial power. But it means not paying too much attention to the colonies themselves. They let them go, essentially, once they've established their loyalty to the new regime. And you need to learn this term, by the way. You'll see it in a lot of places. It'll lead to a period of what's sometimes called salutary neglect, in which these colonies more or less run their own affairs, and they get used to that. And so when it comes to a later period, when the British want to exert, once again, more control, the colonists are saying, wait, you've never done this before, right? So very important for that reason. That's important for understanding how it plays into the creation of the United States eventually. Thirdly, the big thing you get in this chapter is the stuff about the Atlantic slave trade. It's central to the British Empire and to the creation of the American colonies. Kind of hard to overstate it. You'll get some interesting things about changes which the Atlantic slave trade produces, not just within the North American British colonies, but also within African societies from where these slaves are taken. It has a definite impact on societies back in Africa itself. And then finally, a creation of new identities in those North American colonies, in particular two major ones. One, the creation of African American slaves. You have to remember, they're not African Americans when they get there. They're Africans from different countries. Senegal, got all these different countries where they came from. And they don't know each other. They can't speak each other's languages. But of course, over the decades, as slaves begin to be imported in much larger numbers after the Revolution of 1688, they become to merge together into what is essentially a new sort of slave society. In the southern plantation colonies and elsewhere in North America. And so you have that creation there, which, by the way, also cements their declining status. They actually had more rights early on when it wasn't clearly clear, by the way, whether indentured servants or slaves would be the type of labor that would win out. Eventually, of course, for a variety of reasons, it will be slavery. And as that happens, you have the creation. This is the other thing that happens as a result of this, is the creation of a true gentry class in the South, in the southern colonies. And what I mean by true gentry class, all I mean by that is something like a European style, or at least trying to imitate a European style nobility anyway. They want to dress like them. They want to have big houses, country houses like the gentry do back in England. They're not really, by the way. The gentry class in England would have looked down on these people, but they want to imitate them, and they have, because of all the slaves they have, the wealth to do it. And you'll see what an English gentry looks like, by the way, from the Sources and Major Problems. From the diary of William Byrd, who was a big slaveholder. William Byrd's family is the family that from which will be descended people like Robert E. Lee in a later period in American history. And he is very much a member of this sort of, imperial-wide gentry, British gentry in the British Empire. And so you can see some of his, anxieties about his, his daily life. It's kind of interesting. And the way, of course, he treats his slaves. Very interesting, disturbing in some ways, but interesting for what we'll talk about later. And so you have that as a major aspect of what's going on in the period. And then finally, for your readings in the major sources this week, major sources this week, you'll get some of the sources will deal with, again, I mentioned William Byrd. There will be sources on the northern colonies from the primary sources in that period, as well as a particular primary source by Adam Smith. He was a moral philosopher, actually, in the 18th century. He was also one of the first real economists. And they give me an excerpt from his famous work, The Wealth of Nations, in which he examines the role of the colonies within the British Empire. So very interesting, which feeds into the essay I've given you to read for this week. which is by T.H. Breen, which is called Worlds of Goods in the North American colonies. And it deals with the way that as the American colonies became more and more part of the British Empire and had more wealth, they began to buy more and more English stuff from England. They wanted to look like Englishmen, dress like them, follow the latest fashions from London and stuff like this. And so this leads to a process which he calls Anglicization, meaning that these colonies actually become more anglicized, more like the English, as they made part of this pan-British culture that spread through the empire. And in fact, they begin to think of themselves more and more as British subjects as part of this larger empire than they had before, especially the elites of the North American colonies as a result of these economic and social changes that are going on, which again will have profound effects as you get toward the end of this period, which moves us into the period where you'll have those problems that lead to the American Revolution. It will actually create problems because now they're having the same expectations as English subjects back in England. And what's you're going to see is as you get later into that period, the people back in Britain don't think of them as really being full British subjects. They're just kind of colonials, right? So that'll lead to a problem later on. A lot of interesting stuff for this week. One last thing to mention, you'll read this in the emails I've sent you for this week, talking about, and this especially going over when you do the responses for the sources, how to ask questions, how to respond to those questions in the response sheet. So they'll help you out when you go to write the midterm. Remember the question, remember the way the question's phrased is very important, but it's about identity, right? About what American national identity amounts to. So when you go back and answer those questions, think in those terms when you've got to answer those questions. How does this play into it? You take the midterm question, actually write it at the top of your paper, maybe just, or write it a piece of paper as you're reading through this, just to keep it in mind, because this is the kind of thing you're going to need to know when you go back. And I say this because you take good notes, you won't have to go back and reread the text so much. But have that question in mind. When I'm reading this, how does this help me answer? Okay, over the long term, how does all this stuff play into the creation of American national identity, later on, by the early 1800s, by the time of the early republic, after the country has its governmental system established. Because we're talking, hundreds of years before that, but that's what I want you to answer. At least try to answer, and come up with a decent answer within a few pages. And so, you may want to do that. You actually write that question down somewhere. Just, again, people wanted feedback, and so I'll give you some general feedback about this, but just think about that question while you're answering all these other things. Again, I know it's a lot to take in, a lot of information. That's why I didn't give you a lot of stuff to read every week. I wanted you to focus on a small amount, learn that process, learn those habits of asking a question that way. Because, you get lost. Reading this stuff is complicated sometimes. And you don't always have the full picture from what evidence you have. And so you need to have that question. That question is what's going to give you, in your mind, something to focus on. So you know what to think about when you read, and then know what to write down when it comes to notes. And then take that into the essay and say, okay, a general idea. How you're going to answer that question and what you're going to write, which it'll change as you go through it and revise and everything. But you'll have a general idea, and that will help you, I hope, through that process. So learning to keep that question in mind as you read through that stuff should help you. Hopefully, you're moving toward that already. Maybe a few weeks, you'll have to start writing that, I think, for the midterm. So I hope you guys have a great week. If you have any questions, please email me. Hopefully, I've been trying to respond as quickly as I can. I tend to respond more slowly on the weekends because I'm not doing stuff. By any means, try to contact me with any questions. And I hope you guys have a great week. Thanks.